I can do that.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Why don't we get started? Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I have the very good fortune to direct our environmental change and security program here. And on behalf of my colleague Paulo Sotero at the Brazil Institute, and of course our president and director, former Congresswoman Jane Harman, it's a thrill to see all of you here. It's a thrill to have the latest installment of our managing. Paul, what did we?
Managing Our Planet.
Managing Our Planet, yes. I knew that, somehow there was a really kind of a possessive ambition there. Managing Our Planet series, where we're taking a look at global issues in partnership with George Mason University. And it has been a very productive series of discussions, one that we have all been guided by Dr. Thomas Lovejoy, who is at George Mason University and has been a very long-term friend since the very beginning of our program in 1994 to the Wilson Center in bringing his insights as a really world-leading biologist to a broad range of topics. And so today's focus on energy fits quite central to those discussions, those in some ways grand challenges for finding ways to manage these global challenges and manage a planet. It is a topic that is central to what we're trying to do about here at the Wilson Center about these issues. I'll say just a word about the Wilson Center and turn the floor over to my colleague and our partner from George Mason University, Paul Schempf. At the center, we, with our environmental change and security program, have been trying to bring these different worlds together on environment, on development, on health and foreign and security policy even, and bring some communities to come together, understanding that in so many ways these issues overlap, and while we may not see our portfolios to being exactly the same, certainly our tools and sometimes our objectives are not the same. We have to find ways to get out of our stovepipes to better understand what the private sector is doing, what the public sector is doing, what we're doing here at home, and how that connects to things abroad. And so I hope that you will find some of the resources and where we try to capture the insights from these sessions useful. We have some cards and some ways to find us online in our blog, New Security Beat and such. And so it's terrific to see some familiar faces and some new faces to join in this discussion. But I will turn the floor over to Paul to give you a little more sense of the series, and again thank him and his colleagues at George Mason for this very productive partnership, and then we'll get on to the real substance and introduce Greg in the energy discussion. So, Paul.
Thanks, Jeff. So I am playing the role of Tom Lovejoy here today, who has been introducing these series since we started them last year. And we're very glad to have you here today. Looks like a nice crowd. The issue, sustainable solutions for the planet's energy challenge, is really central to so many things that we think about in terms of the future and how we can live on a planet. Our very first of these Managing the Planet series, we focused on population growth and the problem of having a planet with 9 billion people on it, and how we handle that and where we can go with that. The more and more people you have, the more and more energy people want to be using, and the more and more complicated things get. So we're very excited today to have this energy discussion. And it also follows very nicely from last month's discussion by Martha Johnson from the GSA on how government has been dealing with sustainability issues and trying to transform the way such a huge entity conducts their business. So that being said, we're real happy to have this energy discussion, but our speakers here, Greg Katz, who's with us here today, and Dan Kamen from Berkeley, was scheduled to appear with us via video link, but unfortunately, the airlines called him up and rescheduled his flight to Germany by 3 or 4 hours, and he's getting on a plane right now, and he couldn't get the flight rescheduled. So Greg has so generously offered to expand his remarks and go into a little more detail. So what we're going to have is Greg speaking, and then we will open up the floor for the general discussion. So Greg is president of Capital E. He's been with Good Energies in the past, and he's been with the Department of Energy in the, let's see if I can remember this right, he was in the some section of future and renewable energies or something. He can straighten me out on what that was at. But so it's a great pleasure. You have his bios. They were printed and they're outside, so we don't generally go through those in detail at this point. You can consult those documents there. So without further ado, I'll let Greg take over and give his talk.
Thank you very much. While I'm trying to pull up my slides, what percent of what percent of new generation technology in the last 5 years is represented by wind, do you think, in this country? Anybody have a guess? So this is nameplate capacity, new generation for electricity. Last 5 years, what percent is wind? 2%. And any other ideas? So the number's about 35%. And it's a little bit unfair because wind availability is not 100% of the time, so it's not base load. But it does suggest that, that the age of renewables is on us, and that the sort of hackneyed observation. How do I set this up so it does a slide thingy-wingy?
At the bottom right. To the left of that.
Up a little bit.
Above there.
Aha. Thank you.
There we go.
You guys are great. So the number is 35. This is what it looks like for the last 5 years. People used to say, you know, real men and real women don't do clean energy. That's not true anymore. For the last number of years, wind has been larger than nuclear, larger than coal, some years even larger than natural gas. So the story I'm going to talk about today focuses on energy. I'm going to look at buildings. We all, I think in this room, you all look smart, so we all believe in science and think science is a viable basis for policy. So I'm not going to focus on climate change. I am going to talk about some trends, some technical challenges. As a managing director at Good Energies, we're a couple $1 billion venture capital firm, and in the Clinton administration, I was the director of financing for energy efficiency and renewables. We had a budget of about $1.5 billion a year that went into clean energy technology. So this investment in clean energy technology has been going on for a while, and we're now really seeing the benefits. So even though the U.S. had about 35% of nameplate capacity electrical generation added in the last 5 years was wind, we're still very far behind a lot of other countries in terms of penetration. One of the challenges for renewables is if you're going to add renewables, which are intermittent and unreliable, how much can you add before running into issues of availability and reliability? It's an issue I want to talk about. Just a comment on wind. Like other forms of energy, renewables have received subsidies, much less in terms of subsidies than nuclear power or fossil fuels historically, but it's still important. The impact on the wind industry and to a lesser extent the solar industry for maintaining long-term visible federal support in the form of tax credits, production or investment tax credits, is extraordinarily important for both wind and solar. So if we look back, we see a drop of about 90%, 70, 75% in those years where the production tax credit, that is the value that the federal government gave back to an investor in a wind project, when that went away. And we're facing a similar cliff after 2012. So one of the really important steps that we need to take as a country is to re-up that production tax credit. Photovoltaic prices have dropped extremely rapidly. 5 years ago, if you had said, what do you think the cost for installed watt of photovoltaics would be? In 2012, you'd probably say $2, $3. The number is actually under $1, which is absolutely remarkable. You have about an 80% price reduction in photovoltaics in the space of about 4 or 5 years. So the Solyndra bet, for example, I testified in front of the House Oversight Committee in November. There's been a lot of sort of attacks of the administration support of Solyndra, but when that investment was made, polysilicon prices were extremely high, and the cost of solar PV modules had not dropped very far. So a bet on a non-silicon intensive photovoltaic alternative actually made sense as a national strategy, something the press has not really picked up on. I'm going to talk also about where we are with plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. This was a study that was released by the military, among others, and indicates that the price point for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles compared to gas vehicles, that we're really very close to a crossing point there. If you think about the sort of energy spectrum, about 28% is transportation. I think this administration, although far from perfect, has done a remarkable job in saving the automotive industry, and as a obligation for the automotive industry to say you are going to be developing cars that are efficient so you can compete internationally. So I think that where we're going with automotive is enormously exciting. The transition to partial electric or fully electric vehicles is going to be very rapid. The financial and environmental benefits will be large. But it does mean there's going to be more of a burden in electricity. Electricity, about 75% of that is used in buildings. Buildings overall are about 40% of our energy. I'm going to concentrate on the building sector, which is the largest single consumer of energy and the largest single source of CO2. So some more good news. You sometimes still hear the old lie that it's environment versus jobs. Obviously, that's not true. An example of that is in California, starting in the mid-'70s in response to the '73, '74 oil price embargo. California began a moderate but sustained effort to reduce waste in energy. As a result, as you can see today, the consumption in kilowatt hours per capita is where it was 30 years ago. National average has gone up a lot. That delta for California translates into about $1,000 lower cost per family. It makes the state more competitive. It reduces the burden on homeowners and on businesses. So clearly the notion that if you waste more energy, somehow it's good for the economy is a really stupid idea. But you still hear this idea being promulgated. It's idiotic. Here's where the US and California fit in tons of CO2 and then energy intensity. From a CO2 perspective, this is really an energy story. Here's the United States, here's California. We compare favorably to some European countries. There's really no reason why the United States can't be where California is, and there's no reason why California can't be where Switzerland is. The issue is, how much energy do you waste? Do you waste 90%? Do you waste 80%? Can we cut it way back so we're only reducing 70%? That's one of the largest challenges we face. It's a challenge because we have 110 million buildings. Going after all those buildings is much harder than going after the automotive industry or industry, for example, where you've got relatively concentrated manufacturers or users. So one of the big challenges is, how do we drive energy efficiency? Climate change, I thought it was great the Republican governor, candidate Huntsman, early on in his campaign had the integrity to say, the minute that the Republican Party becomes the anti-science party, we have a huge problem. We lose a whole lot of people who would otherwise allow us to win the election in 2012 when we take a position that basically runs counter to what 98 of 100 climate scientists have said, what the National Academy of Sciences has said about what is causing climate change and man's contribution to it. I think we find ourselves on the wrong side of science and therefore in a losing position. If his prognosis is correct, that is, if an anti-science position turns out to not be good politics, that's very encouraging. And let's hope that, that Governor Huntsman is right on this. Turning now to buildings, so I wrote a book which I recommend to you highly, called Greening Our Built World. If you have problems sleeping at night, it's, I'm told, really fantastically useful. The book was sponsored by a number of organizations, including the American Institute of Architects, Federation of American Scientists, National Association of Realtors, American Public Health Association. What we wanted to do in working with 100 Green Architects is to really try and answer in a rigorous way this really important question, which is how much more do green buildings cost compared to conventional buildings, and is it worth it to build a green building? So the perception is that green buildings cost a lot more, in this case 17, 18%. I went with Secretary Chu to China a couple of years ago as part of the Obama trip. In China, the perception is that green buildings cost 25 or 30% more. God help us if that expectation doesn't change. What we found in working with over 100 architects and looking in depth at 170 buildings is that the cost premium is really a little under 2%. And along with that lower cost premium is the, I'm sorry, did somebody?
Could you define what you mean by green building?
So a green building is LEED or equivalent, and LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's developed in an open process by the U.S. Green Building Council. It addresses 5 areas: energy, energy and atmosphere, which are together, water, site, materials, and indoor environmental quality. I was actually the founding chair of the national chapter for the U.S. Green Building Council and the founding chair for the energy and atmosphere part of LEED. So it's something I've poured an enormous amount of my life into. So on a first blush, if you look at just the utilities, so direct energy savings and water savings, and let's say we're focusing on offices, here's our a little bit under 2% premium. It's about $4 a square foot additional that you would pay to build a building that's green. That includes everything except land. So additional design costs, certification costs, additional modeling cost, and then the different technology. If you look over a 20-year period at a net present value basis, and obviously buildings last more than 20 years, so this is conservative. If you discount the future savings on energy and water, you're still at about a 2.5x return in today's dollars in making an investment in a building to be green and healthy rather than a conventional building. And by conventional building, I'm really talking about what the industry does, which is you build the building at the lowest possible cost to barely meet code. That is the conventional design strategy. A green building strategy is really a different one. It's saying we have a target, which might be LEED silver or gold or equivalent, and how are we going to get there? And there's a design process you go through for a green building, which is an integrated design process. You do whole building modeling, you do energy modeling, you have a charrette, you bring everyone together and you say, well, you know, how can we save some money here? Can we get rid of can we eliminate perimeter heating and cooling? We really want to have good views, we want controls. Those sorts of things get folded into a design process that takes the building process, which conventionally is a sequence of things that aren't integrated, and turns it into something that's really very exciting. If you haven't been part of a charrette, it's a lot of fun. In our work, we were able to document impacts on health, in learning, and so this is the complicated one. There's very strong documentation showing a positive correlation between quality of indoor environment, things like quality of light, which you measure by technical aspects like color, rendition, the quality of the air, your access to view sheds, whether you have glare on your screens. I have 3 kids, one of whom has allergies. This really affects people. Their work and living environment affects people. And if your earnings go up, it's because your productivity goes up. And in this particular case, it's test scores, which are correlated with aspects of green design. Test scores positively correlate to earnings. So that there's a small change there, reduced asthma. There's several hundred peer-reviewed studies that look at this. I spoke at the National Academy of Science about 4 years ago. They had a meeting on this. National Academy of Science has come out on this, very conservative organization, very, very clear. If you design a building to be healthy, has better air quality, better light quality, you can measure changes in productivity, output, and health. So when you look at these sort of numbers, you end up driving small but material changes in productivity. And because the cost of an employee on a square foot basis is between 50 and 100 times as large as your energy bill, if you have a small change in productivity and health, for example, 1 less sick day a year, you have a very large economic impact. So when you add those additional benefits back to our green office, here's our 2%, a little under 2% premium, $4 a square foot. Here's our energy and water. You start to fold in some of these additional benefits, you're looking at about a 10x return on a 20-year NPV basis for building a green, healthy building compared to a unhealthy, inefficient building. So the question really is, why? It's no longer why would you do a green building, it's why would you not do a green building? There's a lot of additional benefits we're not able to document because the data is not there. We have we've got funding from Rockefeller. I'll talk actually about this at the end. We've got a data set that's publicly available with a bunch of sponsors, which will put all this data in people's hands. So the bottom line really of this book, and by the way, I should mention that there are only 217 shopping days till Christmas. So get in your order early. It's pretty shameless, huh? It's available in hard copy, soft copy on Amazon, and it's also on iPad. So what has happened is that the kind of hypothesis 5 years ago, people who do green buildings is, you know, if it's a healthy building, people are going to want it. They're going to pay a little more. You're going to have a higher lease rate. No one knew if that was true or not. Today we have the data. So CoStar, which monitors about 40 billion square feet, finds a couple percent premium on rental rates, higher occupancy, lower turnover in green buildings. I tried to lease green space in the city for my office, and it turns out it's really hard to find green space. You pay a premium for it. Our space now is green. It's a LEED platinum space, and you know, I love it. It's natural daylight. I never turn the lights on. The air quality is really good. I don't have glare problems in my screen. Intuitively, you think, you know, I've been in buildings that are crap buildings. I go in and I don't feel very good. I get sleepy. You know, I don't feel very good. I'm just not feeling good. I'm not feeling alert. I'm not kind of picking up the information the professor's communicating or whatever. In other buildings, you feel really good. You come out and you're energetic. So intuitively, we know this is true. Now, quantitatively, we know this is true as well. I'm going to talk about branding. I think this is becoming more and more important. I was at a meeting yesterday. It's the first meeting for let's see if I get this right, the Mayor's Green Ribbon Task Force. So there's a group of outside people asked to advise the city in greening the city. The mayor was very articulate about this. It is becoming a branding issue for cities. There are probably 25 cities now that say, come move to our city, invest in our city, come study in our city because we're a green city. So you're starting to see this become a branding issue at the city level. As I think about brand equity, I think there are really three components. One is brand awareness. So if I'm PNC Bank, which bought, PNC Bank, fifth largest bank, they have a new headquarters building right near the White House. All of their branch banks are green. And what does that mean for them? It means they get free press. They're on television. They get on radio, front page of the local newspaper because their 4,000 square foot branch is green. If it was a conventional branch bank, they would get like 2 lines on page 17. So free media exposure is a big deal, drives traffic. Second is sort of attribute specific. So I mentioned one of my kids has allergies. He had 3 criteria for selecting universities. How far could he get from his parents? How much could he force them to pay? And how green was the school? There's probably others as well. But so the green attributes are becoming really important because it says who we are to the world. And then non-attribute preference is really becoming, I think, the dominant one. So green design is becoming a shorthand for quality. Can you guys hear me in the back, or do I need to use this? For the online. Oh, the online. Hi, guys. So it used to be that a AAA rating was you had to have the right location, marble lobby, you had to look good, and now more and more it's about, well, tell me, are you an Energy Star building? Are you a green building? So green is becoming synonymous with quality. It's becoming a way to differentiate your building. What's interesting is, that we're moving now, sort of the cutting edge architects, people who are really kind of out in front, have moved from LEED to zero net energy in living buildings. Living buildings generate more electricity than they use. They capture all the water, they turn it into gray water, they use it, they put it back in the ground cleaner than it would landed on the building. I mean, these are very, very aggressive targets, but that's the direction that we're moving in. So Comcast Building, this is the tallest building between New York City and Dallas. It's in Philadelphia. It's a 57-story building built by a friend who's at Liberty, which is a real estate investment trust there. Philadelphia, like many of the northeastern cities, has suffered a lot of outmigration, declining tax base, and it has been characteristic, a lot of these northeastern cities, that they're being hollowed out. So when Philadelphia Inquirer, which is the paper of record, saw the plans for this platinum building which connected the downtown and was a real investment in the downtown of the city, they said this building challenges Philadelphia to be great again. So buildings define who we are as a city, as a civic institution. You think of the Middle Ages, that was all about very large churches and cathedrals. Now it's these big type of buildings. On the right-hand side, you have affordable housing. Generally, developers don't want affordable housing. There's a stigma associated with it. Starting about 8 years ago, I worked with Enterprise as a principal advisor in creating what's now the national standard for green affordable housing. It's called Green Communities. It's been used as the design basis for about 50,000 residences. Here you see the solar on top. Green design means that it's a much healthier building. It's more water efficient, more energy efficient, better on indoor environmental quality. After the 15-year hold time for low-income housing, which is required for getting tax advantage federal funding, these things go into the private market. The people who live there buy them. The non-green ones, they tend to be pretty shabby. The green ones are holding up really well. Their pricing is above non-green. And the stigma associated with affordable housing is much reduced by the fact that they're green. America is not about equality of outcome. It's really about equality of opportunity. So if we can create affordable housing that's healthy rather than unhealthy, that is in walkable areas so you don't have to have a lot of cars and spend your money on it, that have low energy and water bills, you're really creating structural opportunity. You're taking away a lot of marginal costs for people who are struggling to raise families. Green is really global. Here's an example of a Chinese development, these entire complex. Green as a standard is growing explosively. I'm actually keynoting a conference in Istanbul next month, which I'm really excited about. There are 85 countries now with their own green building standards. Green buildings are doubling every year, doubling in square footage every year. And it used to be, I think it was the great philosopher Pogo who said, if it exists, it must be possible. We're really at a point where green buildings exist. Everybody knows about green buildings. They've heard of it. Many of you have been in green buildings, whether you know it or not. And so it's really become established enough that people for the first time have a choice. It's not some speculative, fuzzy green idea in the future. These exist today. We've moved from new to existing, so the majority of new green construction in this country are existing buildings that are being retrofitted to make green. We're going from single buildings to what are so what's happening now is a group like PNC, which I mentioned, they're saying we don't want to have a single one of our branch banks recognized as green. We want all of them recognized as green. So they're now designing a zero net energy branch bank, which they're getting recognized as green, and then they've got very minor modification based on the specific place where they put this prototype building in. So it reduces the cost of permitting and kind of scales up the sort of standardization of greening. Branding we talked about, and as I mentioned, the next target, zero net energy campuses. You have 500 universities that have said that they want to go to zero net energy, zero net carbon. You have over 1,000 mayors, 85 million people who've signed up to CO2 reduction targets. And that's really mostly a building story. In our book, we looked at 18 buildings that had a 50% or greater reduction in energy use. On average, those cost 3 to 4% more, payback within 5 or 6 years. This is 5 or 10-year-old technology. So we can get to 50% reduction today, very cost effectively in new design, and a 40–50% reduction in conventional buildings. Some of the exciting areas to look at are cool materials. So there's now things called phase change materials. You put them on the roof, they absorb heat and they release heat. So what does that mean? It means big diurnal swings in temperature. When it gets cold, you're releasing heat, so the temperature is actually mitigated and stays toward a norm. When it gets hot, that gel and that phase change material absorbs that heat, goes to a different phase, so the inside of the building stays cooler. So it's an example of emerging technology that really give us the opportunity to think about getting to zero net energy buildings. Electrochromic windows, so I'm actually going to talk about that in a little bit. Balance of systems for photovoltaics is a company I'm involved in that basically says, soup to nuts, you come to us and we can help you figure out photovoltaics. So they had, Hertz came to them and said, we have 1,500 rooftops, we want to put PV in some, but we can't visit all these sites, what do we do? And they said, well, you know, we can look at this from space, we can map this, we figure out what part of the rooftop is not in shadow, we have relationships with a lot of contractors, so we can actually put together the pricing on this, we know your utility charges. They came back within 2 weeks, ranked the 1,500 rooftops and said, these are the ones that are most cost effective, payback of 3 years or less. So Enterprise did the first 4 megawatts. They're now putting in the next 8 megawatts. Because the cost of PV has dropped so much, as we talked about earlier, to under $1 a watt, about 70% of the installed cost now is balance of systems. So what we're doing is we're solving those balance of system things. How do you design it? How do you prepackage it? How do you get less expensive mounting? How do you do rollout PV? The price of PV and wind is going to keep coming down pretty steeply. We're at about 3 megawatts of installed rooftop. We're going to get to around 400 megawatts. That represents on the order of about 15% of US power generation. And if you put PV on rooftops, you're displacing retail power and you're not burdening the transmission and distribution system. It makes much more sense than utility scale PV out in the desert where you've got to bring all that power back in and you're displacing wholesale power, which is typically half the cost of retail. We released a study that we did with Citigroup and JP Morgan a little bit earlier, actually, sorry, at the end of last year, looking at models to scale energy efficiency financing. Energy efficiency financing now is about a $20 billion a year industry. It needs to be about $150 billion. At $150 billion a year, we can get about 5 to 6 year returns on capital. So one of the biggest institutional challenges now with energy efficiency is how do large banks deploy capital in the billions of dollars of scale into buildings where they really don't have the ability to go in and say, you know what, you didn't pay, I'm taking that light bulb back out. Not going to happen. With PV, okay, I can probably take that off. So there's a very important bill in California last week enabling on-bill financing, which essentially means that you can put money in for energy efficiency, you borrow it from a capital provider, that money recapture comes through the utility. Essentially, they're going to say, you know, your utility bill went down from $150 to $90, and we're going to take, of that $60 savings, we're going to take 50 of it out to repay your capital provider. And by the way, you don't pay that, we're turning off your electricity. So in the back, you have a question?
Sorry, I just have a question on that note. We've known about the performance-based job model and stuff for a while now. At the Cannon Building, I'm with the Green Building Institute, both a nonprofit. Our companies did that at the Cannon Building, and very few people working there know about this. So our problem isn't necessarily this stuff that's getting people in that building to recognize what's right under their noses is now energy efficient, water efficient, has a green roof thanks to financing through Johnson Controls. And they don't know anything about it.
So you should tell them. Energy efficiency is not the world's sexiest subject, I found when I was a college student interested in this subject. It probably never will be. Green buildings are more interesting. Some of the interesting innovation around communication and making efficiency sticky is coming through shifting efficiency communication onto social medium like Facebook. So there's a company that was actually founded here, moved to Boston, called Earth Aid. And EarthAid basically communicates through your own self-created network through things like Facebook, and it makes those energy efficiency insights much more sticky. And you've got virtual communities, which you've created, which are long-term communities because they're self-selected, and they provide, I think, pretty powerful ways to communicate opportunities and needs for greening. These are the 18 buildings I talked about with energy efficiency improvements of at least 50%. And again, this is with 10-year-old technology. So the technology, some of which I'll talk about shortly, that we're seeing today allow you to get much deeper reductions much more efficiently. Smart Grid was on the board of Tendril, which is the leading residential smart grid company, and I'm still on the advisory board to AlertMe, which is a UK-based smart grid company. This is a study done by FERC, and it basically said, you know, business as usual, electricity growth is 1.7% a year. If we implement smart grid fully, that could flatten down to zero. We could have no growth in electricity while this country goes from 300 million to 400 million people. But the value of smart grid really goes beyond that. It's about reshaping load to allow us to bring in intermittent renewables and still understand and control our electricity generation. This is without storage. So my point is really, if you look at one of the main areas of venture capital investment now, it's storage. And these are all capital intensive assets. They're things like flywheels or lithium ion batteries or compressed air, that kind of thing. What they don't think about is there's an alternative to capital intensive storage, which is energy efficiency. If I can reshape my load, I can get the equivalent of storage at much lower cost. This is a very big deal. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about it as we go through this. If you look at California, their peak load is over 50 gigawatts. And what that means is you've got generating assets that are running 50 hours, 100, 200 hours a year. That's pretty economically inefficient. Peak load, as you imagine, is the summer afternoons. You're looking at 9, 10% transition. So the challenge is, how do you reshape load? And it's particularly important because the peak's getting peakier, right? We have more air conditioning. Building is going on in places that have air conditioning. The temperature is getting hotter. The extremes in weather are getting greater. So what happens when you have basically you put a window around a band, let's say from 2 o'clock to 6 o'clock, when you have maximum electricity usage, which is this piece right here, but translated from an annual 8,760 hours to your 24-hour cycle in the late afternoon. What if we say we have a fixed incentive with a thermostat where consumption drops, and what if you do it with an enabler? Worry about reshaping load at a building level in a way that is economically persuasive to the homeowner or to the host, the company, and allows the utility to get rid of this very expensive chunk of peaking capacity, or when it shuts down its coal plant, to not build a replacement electricity plant. So the savings potential from solving this problem is on the order of trillions of dollars a year. There's a company I just joined the board of called Building IQ. Building IQ is the first commercial building monitoring and management system I know of that deals with thermal load. So it looks ahead a couple days, says, you know what, average temperature normally at this time of year is 42 degrees. It's going to be warmer. It'll be 53 degrees, and it's going to be sunny. So what does that mean? It means that I'm going to have to preheat my building less in the morning. I'm going to be getting solar heat gain, which translates into thermal mass heating, which means I'm going to be releasing heat in the evening. And now I'm going to refine my building energy use to reflect that. And I'm going to say I'm going to have solar on the roof, and maybe I'm going to have wind. So when are those going to, when am I going to have solar availability? Well, next day's projection on solar pretty accurate. Wind less so, but I can take that data and start to reshape my load within building to end up with the performance on terms of energy consumption that I want. Again, going back to eliminating that peak load. So I have equity in this company, so you should absolutely go out and immediately purchase. Zero net energy cities. We talked about Washington, D.C., but this is a really big emerging area for cities. So D.C. is spending $1 billion over the next couple years to expand its wastewater treatment capability. It could probably spend about $100 to $150 million of that and go back upstream and provide incentives to reduce the peak water runoff, those surges in water that come after a storm. So it would do things like promote porous pavements, promote green roofs that capture water and release water slowly. So our solution has always been downstream. There's all this crap coming out of this urban system. We're going to have to pour lots of money into fixing it. It doesn't make sense. It makes much more sense to go back upstream, do labor-intensive things, make the buildings more comfortable, make pavements porous, make parking lots porous, put in gray water system, put in green roofs. And that's the direction cities are going. The capital cost savings potentially for cities and operating cost savings are enormous. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, but in this particular example, what you're seeing is individual buildings, when you control them for renewables, I can say, look, I'm controlling these buildings here, I've got a solar park here and wind. I can take all these buildings together and say, I'm going to reshape the load around multiple distributed buildings to allow me to capture wind when it's available or reflect when wind is not available. So now you're making the whole city intelligent, which reshapes load, avoids capital costs, reduces emissions. So in the next few years, you're going to hear a lot more about eco-cities, green cities. I met with the Senior Vice President of Schneider this morning. These are very big companies, 100,000 people companies. JCI, Honeywell, AECOM, Cisco, IBM, they all have in the last year developed big green city or eco-city programs because the savings opportunities are so large. So this is an exciting space to watch. This is a company I was on the board of for a number of years, Sage Electroma Glass, incredibly exciting technology, funded out of DOE over a period of about 15 years. If you have a conventional piece of glass in a commercial building like this today, what you've got is 2 sheets of glass, and it has an inert gas in it like argon, and it's got a selective surface coating on it that keeps out all of ultraviolet light and lets in about 40% of daylight. So that's a decent piece of glass. The problem with it is, in the winter, I want a lot more light than that. And in the summer afternoons, I want a lot less light than that, because that solar heat gain drives my need to put in perimeter air conditioning. It drives my having a 400-ton air conditioning unit on the roof. So what happens if I could keep that solar light out, which is what this does? So on the inside of the outer surface, you've got a couple micron thick set of depositions on this, and through a small electrical charge, I can dim up or dim down how much light comes through that pane of glass. I can go up to 65% light, so on an overcast days, I get lots of natural light. I can keep my lights off. On summer days, I can dial it down to 2%, so I'm getting just enough light that I'm getting my 50-foot candles or whatever it is I want on my space. My overhead lights are off. I'm getting almost no heat from the outside. My air conditioning is not on. In fact, I can go back and I can get rid of somewhere around 50% of my air conditioning load. So this technology by itself in commercial buildings cuts peak load by about 25%. And they're doing scale. They're in about 200 buildings now. Very, very exciting single technology. So by the way, if you add to this, if you say, okay, I'm going to take all space where there's perimeter glass, I'm going to put this glass in, I'm going to put in dimmable lights, and I'm going to put in sensors that sense how much light there is, and sensors about whether there's anybody in the room or not. So I walk into a room and then the light goes on, or I walk into the room and there's no lights come on. Why? Because I've already got my 50-foot candles on my working space. And as the light gets darker outside, as there's less and less light, you go into the evening or there's rain or something, this opens up and allows a lot more natural light to come through, and my light's still stuff. Now it's evening. Oh, this is 65% transparent. Most of the natural light is coming through. The sensor tells me there are people in the room, and it says, you know, we need a little bit more light here. So your dimmable light starts to come on. So I'm still getting the light that I want on the surface. I get up and leave the room. After 5 minutes, the lights go off. That saves around 85% of your internal lighting load. Your 2 big loads for air conditioning that drive peak are air conditioning and their lighting. So through this kind of strategy, you can radically reshape and reduce your electricity burden from HVAC and lighting. There is a very cool company in this town called Skyline, and Skyline is a solar thermal company. So solar thermal is really about displacing heat, which is done from electricity heating or gas heating, and instead using solar panels. So you have these big solar installations at GWU, American University. Those are done by Skyline. Skyline has a new business model. I say to you, Mr. University or Mr. Business Owner, enter into a contract to buy thermal, basically hot water from me for 15 years. then I will install these projects on your rooftop. You get a lower bill from day one, and we guarantee it's lower throughout. And I can take this thing, and they've now got a $30 million debt facility from Pepco, and I can make a lot of money off it. Thermal is around 6% of residential energy use, so it's not huge, but it's substantial. And it's an example of how technologies, which have gotten better on solar thermal, have been prevented because you have a business model that doesn't work. Now there's a business model that works. So this company is growing extremely rapidly. It's a DC company, which is pretty cool. I talked about some of these things already. For university presidents now, this is a very big deal. Their CO2 targets and then releasing information. University adoption, school adoption of green design is a very big deal. At Stanford, they put in this new quad. It was 26%, I think, better than the state mandates. And the university president said, you know, that's not good enough. They raised another $20 million to make it 60% better. That $20 million they raised, easiest money they've ever raised. People are very excited about doing green stuff. Or Sidwell here, where the president's kids go to school, that's a very green school. It reflects their values, Quaker values. Values are important. So I think there's a good news story there. There's a small not-for-profit I've just joined the board of called the Global Cool City Network. So the notion here is that, that as you go downtown and you switch from light color to dark color, your temperature goes up. So if you look at LA, LA's temperature has gone up 1 degree Fahrenheit every 15 years since the 1920s. You've gone from orange groves to more hard top to light buildings to heavier buildings to roads, which are black in color, rooftops, which are black in color. So the idea here is that you can reverse that by putting in place programs which say to people, make your roof a high albedo, a high reflectivity roof. And there's an entire science around it. There's something called the U.S. Cool Roof Rating Council. So if you're ever thinking of putting on a new roof or a new paint, you should go to it. I had a house on Capitol Hill, black PDM rubber roof on the 3rd floor of my bedroom was unbelievably hot in the summer. I couldn't sleep in my bedroom. So I bought this 5-bucket gallon of white paint through the U.S. Cool Roof Rating Council and rolled it out with a roller, and all of a sudden I could sleep in my bedroom in the summer, and the air conditioning bill went way down. This is very, very simple. We're working now with 10 of the largest cities in the world, and the opportunity for the cities to cut their energy costs is enormous. If you think about smog formation, it requires temperature. You can cut smog and ozone formation a lot by reducing temperature. The higher temperature makes people really ill, especially the elderly, and also obviously this delta here, which represents what you can do in terms of cutting temperature, ambient temperature in city, represents an enormous air conditioning burden. So another example of a technology and policy innovation that can have quite large impacts. So, because a lot of people harassed me about getting data on this thing, I got funding from Rockefeller and another foundation to put all this data online free. Actually, there's other sponsors on this. This is a little bit out of date. But our website is just being stood up now, and we're looking for more partners. So if you're part of an institution like a university or the Woodrow Wilson Center or somebody else, please join us. We have funding. We're not looking for funding. We're looking for partners who are involved in buildings, who want to contribute their data on green buildings and are interested in having that data be publicly available for free. Because what happens right now, and I know this because I get people asking me for information a lot, is you'll have somebody who believes that a building should be green. It could be their university building, could be a library, it could be whatever building. And they pull together this sort of hodgepodge of information, and they go in front of the investment committee. And the investment committee says, well, this isn't very persuasive. You've given me a bit of data, but it doesn't really tell me about my state or my building type. So with this, you can go through and say, I want all buildings of this building size or this type in this location, this level of greenness. Here's how much more they cost. Here are the savings. Here's the payback. So we're excited that this is going online, and we're looking for more sponsors. It's gbdata.org. In our book, we took a look at where we're going with buildings. So the 3 sectors we talked about, industry, transportation, and buildings, you know, the turnover time for transportation is around 15 years. You replace your car every 15 years. So if we upgrade our cars, we've got 3 cycles in the space of 45 years. over that time, you bet you don't even have one cycle of building. So solving the building problem from a CO2 perspective is the largest challenge we have. Industry is, only about 26% or something of energy in CO2, and they're making rational investments in properties that they own. So if we can solve the green building issue and get our buildings so they cut CO2 by 80%, we can meet the targets the scientists have laid out for us to not have global warming be excessive. In the book, we modeled through what this means. So here's where we are today, millions of metric tons for buildings. Business as usual is here, given population growth. Here's where we are today. Through a series of measures, we can get close to an 80% reduction. Now, some people would tell you that this kind of investment would bankrupt the country, and the companies that do it. That turns out to not be true. So there is a cost premium. We've talked about a little under 2%. That represents about $200 billion of additional investments to make buildings new and retrofitted greener over the next 30, 40 years. Net present value, that is, you take those costs and you offset it with the benefits associated with lower utility bills. With water, you're creating about $400 billion in value. And when you layer on some of the additional benefits related to health, only some of the benefits, it's about $1 trillion wealth creation opportunity to make our buildings aggressively greener over the next 30 or 40 years. So when people tell you it's environment versus jobs, tell them to take a hike. There is very little data to support this. In almost all cases, the kind of measures that are being proposed for improving technology, for improving efficiency, for improving clean power generation are good for the economy and create jobs. And I get a little bit exercised about this point because I had one of the congressmen who happened to be a Tea Party person who I was testifying to in November on this, spent about 4 minutes talking about how he, a white guy, was a businessman, had been a businessman before coming before Congress, and therefore as a businessman he knew how to drive industry change, understood technology, knew how to create jobs, and that this stuff that I was saying about there's a big opportunity to save money and address environmental concerns wasn't right, because he as a businessman understood this. At the end of this long ramble, he admitted he'd spent an entire professional life selling cars. So I wanted to tell him he was an idiot and he didn't know anything, but I didn't do that. So I think that's about it. I think this point is a really important point. I don't think we should back down on science as being a valid metric for policy. I don't think we should back down on saying it's environment and jobs in most cases. And I think going back to the buildings and the places we work and saying, are we green? Why not? How do we get there? Let's go ahead and do this. Let's own this problem ourselves and deal with it. So anyway, I will close with that and look forward to any questions you have. Thank you.
So let me just jump in here and have a seat. We will start taking questions from the audience. I'm going to get ahead of the curve here and just point out that George Mason has signed the President's carbon commitment, climate commitment for the university. We have with us here today Dan Scleroux, who's our, what is your role? You're a sustainability, what's that?
Fellow sustainability.
He's the sustainability fellow in the office of the provost, coordinating all sustainability activities in the academic side of the university. We also have a very energetic sustainability office within the physical plant and actually making sure that we're delivering on this President's climate challenge. So with that, I think we'll open the floor up to questions, and we're going to do the microphone, so if you would ask the question into the microphone.
This is a follow-up on a question I asked you when you started talking about green, and I asked you whether it was just LED or beyond. You just, but most of the back half of your talk goes well beyond LED, because you were talking about zero energy buildings and living buildings, right? I mean, for example, the last view graph where you pointed out that on a 30-year time scale you can get it to pay off. That's well beyond the LEED building, isn't it?
It is.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of discount rates then do you use for your NPV calculation?
So it varies, typically 7%, but you assume energy prices are going to rise at probably above inflation, so you've got a delta there of a couple percent. So this is all detailed. It's all kind of excruciatingly detailed. They're different appropriate discount rates. I mean, the cost of capital for the federal government is obviously less than it is for the private
Right.
sector, for example.
Because all these MPVs, of course, makes a tremendous difference what you use for
Yeah.
discount rate. And finally, do any, well, this is kind of a funny question given what I just asked you, but when you're talking about green, at the start, you're mainly LEED. Do any of your European friends give you a hard time about calling LEED green at this point? I mean, they're much more into zero energy and positive energy, aren't they? At least I've heard from European friends who kind of scoff at LED standards.
So LEED is, LEED, there are other existing green building standards that preceded LEED. There's BREEAM in the UK and CASB in Japan. We decided to create LEED because those are pretty incomplete. LEED is actually becoming the norm, so it's becoming the sort of single international standard for green design. I'm going to be speaking in Turkey in a couple weeks at a conference on green buildings. So I was looking today at the Turkish Green Building Council. Some of them follow BREEAM, most of them follow LEED, and I think that's because it's probably a more complete standard, because a lot of it has more publicity, because it's got more of a rating basis. And I just think that people are more comfortable with it. So is it perfect? No. Can you go beyond that to zero net energy buildings or living buildings? Absolutely. But the challenge is for LEED that it's got to both be aggressive enough to have an impact and yet be accessible enough that it can be widely deployed. And
To
that's,
what extent was the LEED standard designed used?
To what extent was the LEED standard designed was the idea that it would be payable on a 5-year or 10-year time scale? You know, you pointed out that it pays off, but is that a circular argument because the standard was designed so it would do that?
well, some LEED buildings don't pay. Some LEED buildings never pay. I mean, there are a couple LEED buildings that are 10 or 15% premium. Those are not going to pay back. Some LEED buildings don't cost any more. I think the intent in the design of LEED by the U.S. Green Building Council was to create a standard that industry and finance as well as NGOs could support and that would be transformative. So yes, I think there was some weighing of a balance between how far do you want to go, not go too far, and yet far enough that it makes a difference. So today the average green building, new or retrofit, is typically 35 to 40% reduction in energy and water. C&D waste diversion in non-green buildings about 30%. In green buildings it's about 90%. So it makes a difference. It's a big step in the right direction.
Yes, down there.
Ed Barks of Barks Communications. Greg, I'm a communicator, not a scientist, but I find that your discussion of the environment versus jobs issue to be compelling. Tell me a little bit, if you would, in your discussions with whether it's a policymaker or a member of the media or somebody in a presentation like this, what are you finding really resonates in terms of the message that you can deliver with respect to the environment and jobs issue, and perhaps the one or two examples that you cite that are just so powerful it really helps to drive that point across? Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Seeing is believing. And if you join the local chapter of the U.S. Green Building Council, it's like $40 a year. They have regular tours of these green buildings, residential, multi-unit residential, commercial, public, schools. And it's wonderful to walk through those because you really get a sense that these are more attractive buildings. The light quality is good. I'm a bit of a tech nut, so I love to see, what the different technology choices and designs were. But I think seeing really is believing, because if you haven't spent time in a green building, you think, okay, well, maybe it's ugly or maybe it's like weird or uncomfortable, and you find, hey, it's more comfortable and people love it because you talk to people in the buildings, you like working. Yeah, I love working here. I once asked, I had 3 or 4 friends I talked to who ran architectural firms who were early in the green building movement. I said, well, what does it mean that you're known for doing green buildings? And they said something along the lines of, we get to hire better people, we get to work them longer, and we get to pay them less, which is only partly tongue-in-cheek. You know, I mean, the original redesign for the World Trade Center was a very, very green building that included wind generation. It's still a green building, but doesn't have wind generation. So you think about the symbolism of that. You had U.S. oil money going to Saudi Arabia, going to a terrorist group that used that money to knock down this building. And so the replacement of that building is a much more energy efficient building. It's importing less oil. And here's this building sitting at the edge of an island with rising temperature and rising oceans around it. It's a very eloquent sort of symmetry to replace the World Trade Center with something as green as that building is. You know, I think in sort of answering your question, I would take people by the hand and walk them through buildings and say, what do you think of it? And people say, you know, I really like this building. And how much more did it cost? Well, how much do you think it cost? I don't know, 10%, 20%? It's like the first question I had about wind. How much is wind? Well, we're behind in our views because the building environment is a very static thing. Energy is very static. We've got generation plants that were put in after the Second World War. The reality is very different. Green buildings are going through a radical transformation. They're radically reshaping how we do buildings. And clean power generation now is becoming dominant. And if we don't screw it up, we're going to go through a pretty rapid transition towards clean energy. The coal plants that are coming offline are going to be replaced by much cleaner generation. So it's a sort of best of time, worst of time, I think. On the job side, this guy named Skip Leitner, who has been at EPA, is now at the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy. He's probably done the best work on it. But if you think about energy efficiency, what you're really doing is you're saying, I'm going to put in more insulation and sealing the envelope of the building. That clearly takes more time than a conventional building. So I'm trading off a little bit more upfront cost and paying for people's time. I'm paying for employment, and I'm reducing the back-end cost of imported energy. That's a pretty good trade-off from a security perspective. The military, I mean, actually the thing that I think sort of resonated perhaps most in this testimony to the House Oversight Committee in November was the fact that the military is greener than green. I mean, they are going crazy with this stuff because they don't care about the politics. They care about the reality. And the reality is if you forward deploy troops and you've got to ship in diesel to be used in highly inefficient tents and inefficient generators, those transport units are subject to IEDs. People get killed. So they're highly motivated on green buildings. And Navy adopted LEED before it was even public. They adopted it as their lead, as their design protocol. So I guess my long-winded answer is I would take people through a building. I would talk about the kind of the rationale behind it, and I'd say, look, you know, it works for the military, so go argue with them.
Just one comment here. It would be nice if we'd introduce ourselves as to who's asking the question when we're going, and we'd wait for the microphone. So I see I got over here.
I'm Helen Raffel. I work with Resources for the Future, but I live in a very big apartment building up at DuPont Circle, more than 100 apartments, and the management agency is interested in going green. They've already changed all the light bulbs in the interior and so forth. What's the best reference for them? I've been talking about, you know, putting solar panels on the roof, but is this the best way for them to get more information about how to go if they don't already know?
Yeah, I think it's good. I think the free GB database in 2 months will be very helpful. You know, join the Green Building Council. I mean, I think there are multi-unit residential green retrofits that have been pretty successful, as well as new construction. Go and take a look at those, and you know, take your building owner through and say, hey, you know, we want this, and by the way, if you're paying for the energy bill and you're taking 50 cents per square foot off, that goes to you. That's a pretty good story. And as I say, there are only 217 shopping days till Christmas, so if you get a jump on your shopping, I think that would be great. You'd double my sales if you bought a book, so I'd be eternally grateful.
Another very quick question. I think I've heard that DC is the lead green building city in the
Depends how
in the
you
United
measure it. Pittsburgh claims that, others, but it is one of the top 5 in the country. Yeah.
Question here in the center.
Hi, Megan McAvoy of Elysian Energy. I was just wondering, what type of methods did you use to determine productivity gains in a building? Because I know some of them look at typing tests, for example, which aren't necessarily reflective of true productivity gains in a building.
Yeah, that's a good question. So productivity is really, really tough. The first studies that were done on this are done in those unusual commercial facilities where you're handling, for example, mail. So you can measure throughput on mail. They were looking at processing insurance forms where they're standardized forms and you're measuring throughput. They're a Boeing plant where they were looking at number of mistakes. So there's a relatively small percentage of tasks being done that are repetitive enough and measurable enough that you can actually measure changes in throughput or quality. I think the best single collection of peer-reviewed studies on the relationship between some aspect of high productivity, healthy buildings and productivity or some other measure of improvement is done out of Carnegie Mellon. It's called the BIDS database. They've got a couple of hundred peer-reviewed studies in there, much from North America, a lot from Europe, that look at the improvements, for example, in test scores and quality of lighting, or incidents of sick building syndrome and air conditioning control. So you've probably got 400 or 500 peer-reviewed studies now. National Academy of Sciences has reviewed those, basically said on those metrics green buildings are better. One area green buildings are not better and are often worse as acoustics, because green buildings tend to be much more open, so it's an area of kind of ongoing revision. What we did is, what happens if you ignore this data is you're basically saying I'd rather be exactly right than I'd rather be exactly wrong than approximately right. What we did is we looked at the range of studies. We took the bottom end, most conservative end of the range in each case. So if you look at work by someone like Judith Heerwagen out of Pacific Northwest National Labs on this, her numbers are much more aggressive about asserting much larger improvements in productivity and health. The data we used is conservative. Kaiser Permanente and a lot of other big health providers are using this data to drive changes in design and layout and energy. And the numbers that they're seeing are actually a much larger response to healthy design than we assumed in our study. Our study was pretty conservative, deliberately.
Okay, we're going to go over here, and then we had someone down. Yeah, so we'll do.
And also the woman's.
John Petters, AAAS fellow at DOE. I was wondering what you would think about getting people to invest in rental properties, energy efficiency in rental properties. I mean, I'm renting my apartment. I pay the energy bill, but the person who owns the building is, of course, not gonna pay for these kind of investments. They're not seeing any benefit from it. I would, but I'm going to be gone in a couple of years. So
it's tough when you have a split ownership issue. That's a tough issue. I mean, you could go to your landlord and say, look, my energy bill has been X. If I can reduce it, can I keep some of it? Or more and more of what of the energy burden is plug load. So I could imagine you're saying, I'm going to be taking some of my equipment with me. Heck, I might even take my $10 or $15 light bulbs with me. So I'm going to make investments in those things that are portable. Other than that, it's kind of hard. I mean, the split incentive issue is a really big problem.
I know Elysian Energy has some of these contracts and Granuit, but in Maryland, BG&E has a lot of special deals for home energy things. And if you're in Maryland, I'm in a 3-story building, that's still considered a residential property for them. So they'll come in and do a quick check for free. But they have a program rolling out right now that's only $100 for the full-on energy audit. That includes the blower doors and the blower door and depressurizing your house and the thermal camera and the whole bit. So I'm assuming, especially with Mayor Gray getting on board in DC, if you're in DC, that if that doesn't exist yet, that it will very shortly. I would keep your eye on Sustainable DC. I don't know if that's the program you're working on. They have more than a few going on, but
Where do you go for, if you're in Maryland, to access
Maryland
this?
BG&E has a special program, but Elysian Energy, actually, we work with Jim Conlon for some training. He's a very excellent guy. He's been on the Today Show, so if you need energy auditing stuff, go see those guys. But BG&E has a great site, their Energy Smart site, and the sustainable. If you search Sustainable DC, that just started up, but it's rolling quickly. So they're going to centralize a lot of that information. So just keep your eye on that.
Okay, next up front here.
James Hooser, fellow ITA Western Hemisphere. My question's about jobs. Often when opponents of reducing consumption of fossil fuels, their concern is that a reduction in extraction will result in a reduction in the workforce for that industry and net loss of jobs. So you had some examples of increases in the construction industry and the design industry for green technologies. What are some other examples of jobs that are created not jobs lost in the next 40 years from resource depletion, but jobs created in the next 5 to 10 years from green technologies?
So 3 areas you have increased jobs with green buildings is energy efficiency, we talked about, renewables, those, mostly the assembly and we may be buying our solar panels from China, the film, but essentially the assembly and mounting and all that, and the wiring is done in the U.S. And then the third area is really waste separation. So, as I mentioned, the construction and demolition waste separation and recycling for green buildings is around 90%. And which basically means at the site you've got lots of different bins. I'm putting aluminum here, and I'm putting glass in here, or different colored glass, and I'm putting sheetrock in here. I'm really separating it out. And then that, instead of going to landfill, goes to some place where there's separation and reuse. That's pretty labor intensive. So those are 3 areas where there's a lot of job creation in green buildings or green retrofits compared to conventional construction, conventional retrofits.
Two comments. One, at George Mason, we now actually have LEED Silver as our baseline. So it almost seems like, as we're looking around the community, that that's both in academic campuses as well as broadly, that's a no-brainer at this point, which I know you're aware of. But some of my concerns are like, how do we keep pushing towards the top? Thinking about LEED Platinum or net zero or living buildings and things like that. And then my second question is, in Fairfax County, we've just got done producing a greenhouse gas inventory for the last 5 years. And whereas emissions per capita are more or less stable, per capita keeps going up. And so I'm wondering, in terms of your thought about density of population and other issues related to population growth, whether even if this per capita approach is appropriate, or whether we really have to think about an aerial emissions and energy usage. Thanks.
So on the first one, I mean, I agree with you. 5 years ago, the baseline was LEED certified, and then it became silver. More and more you see the baseline being gold. LEED itself is becoming more aggressive, so as standards change, like the ASHRAE 90.1 standard, those, as the efficiency requirements and the standards improve, they also improve in LEED. I think it makes sense to say LEED's our baseline, plus we're doing 40% or 50% energy reduction, or water reduction, or whatever it is, and then to the extent that you want to embrace a zero net energy, I think it's great. I know in the campuses I've had the opportunity to speak at and talk to, there's a very high level of excitement and student engagement. It's like, wow, the university's relevant to me, it listens to me, it cares about me. There's a real sense of excitement about that, which is really fun. Your second question is really about sort of the larger footprint. There's There's a developer in the Midwest called AES that we worked with, and there's a section in here on this where they took a conventional residential development. So let's say this tabletop was 60 acres. Normally you'd take the 200 homes and you'd spread them across, and then you'd build the infrastructure to support it. And what they did instead was they concentrated the developments with much smaller individual footprints for home yards, but all of them looked out over green. So 60% of the land was set aside as, you know, forest or playing fields or whatever, reserves. And as a result, the infrastructure costs were less. So the city cost to put in the infrastructure, particularly the roads, the water, wastewater, was about $12,000 less a unit. There was quite a lot less driving because people now had amenities to walk to, and they were kind of closer to each other. There's more walking. Easier to link it to places to walk to like retail. They sell for higher rates, and their occupancy is higher. So you kind of say, well, if that's the case, why the heck do we still do all these dumb designs? In my neighborhood in Chevy Chase, D.C., there was opposition to renewing a license for a small commercial store. They expanded the store, and there's always like 25 or 30 people hanging around the store, right? Broad Branch Market, because you've got a little ice cream shop, and you get fresh break bed and prepared food, and it's become this community center. People love it. Even the neighbors love it. So people are afraid of zoning restrictions, which were put in following the First World War through the Second World War and beyond, and they were about, hey, you don't want a manufacturing facility because they could be processing dead horses. Well, there's not a lot of that going on. The changes to zoning are very burdensome. Where you see it happening a lot is in Mississippi and Louisiana post-Katrina, where they're saying, you know, this doesn't work. We're going to put in we're going to take out all of the old zoning, which is no, 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 no. Very large turning radiuses, minimum very wide streets, none of which makes sense, and we're going to replace it with something which makes more sense, like transect-based development, which DPZ developed, which has done about 300 of these high-density mixed-use centers. We have got to rethink how we do building. People want to live in places that have meaning, and by meaning I mean you don't get in a car to drive to go to the bathroom or pick up your mail. By meaning I mean you can walk down the street, you can go to a store, you go to a school, you go to a church, you go to a place that has context. People pay more for that. Downtown, if you look at the price per square foot in downtown DC, say around DuPont, which somebody mentioned, and the McMansions, which are sort of 40, 50 minutes out, the cost per square foot and market clearing prices for downtown walkable DC has doubled relative to these remote McMansions. So you're seeing so the people are really expressing their values. We want a community where there's meaning, and you're seeing that in prices. Zoning has not kept up with it at all, it's incredibly frustrating. This kind of design is done by exception rather than as a norm. It's incredibly frustrating.
Okay, so we'll go over here, and then we have back there.
Yes, I attend National Presbyterian Church, which has a big cathedral building on Nebraska Avenue Northwest, and it's occurred to me that it has several thousand square feet of roof area that are potentially for PV, south-facing roof area. But it was built in 1967 when oil was $20 a barrel, and there's not a double glazed window in the whole place. I don't know where we would begin. Huge electric bill, $360,000 a year, that would be helpful to cut back, but there are also issues with heating that can't really be dealt with PV probably. So it's a big possibility, but don't even know where to begin with something like that.
So we did a section in the book on houses of worship, Catholic, Protestant. I think there was one Hindu in there, one or two Jewish temples, but basically a broad range of churches and places of worship, and also other buildings that are on religious campuses, places of faith. And there's sort of the problem with churches is they're very large and they're not used very much, so your payback is extremely long. So that's really challenging. But there's almost two balance sheets that we saw, and they're very kind of moving quotes that we got, that people said to us that, you know, this has allowed us to walk in, you know, to walk our talk, basically. There were some church groups where there was so much excitement and engagement that the number of people coming to church on Sundays doubled. there was a sense of, wow, we're not talking abstract, we're talking real. We're allowing our values to be expressed through our community. The fundraising was pretty successful. So I would suggest to you that this case study in here, and this book is like $23 or something on Amazon, so it's not very expensive, would be a useful place to go to. And we provide points of contacts and URLs, so you can contact people and say, what was your experience? How did you do it? Is there a template? How did you raise money? What's the sequence of funding for this? There's an initiative I was involved in helping to create which has gotten DOE funding, which is trying to green, I guess, 50,000 churches. And if you give me your card, I'll connect you to the person who's doing that.
Striped shirt. Then I'll get, we get one.
Thank you. David Nicholson from Mercy Corps. I'm interested in the emerging markets perspective. Obviously, the rate of urbanization in a lot of countries, and obviously China, Brazil, but a lot of other places, is meaning that basically crappy buildings are being thrown up all over the world. Do you see a way of getting some of this technology, some of these skills, quickly mainstreamed into these places? And as an extra point, since a lot of this is done from money from the European Union, from USAID, things like that, is there a way of ensuring that they're funding smarter design?
So this is a sort of a enormous question. So, dictatorship is much more efficient than democracy, most efficient form of government. So China is doing really exciting things in this area. It's created building standards. It's actually hired a lot of people to do enforcement. And in the big cities, you're starting to see changes in building design. It is crazy that the same building that we build in Dallas is essentially the same building we build in Bismarck or that we build in Beijing. It's just insane. They're often very intelligent domestic building practices which have kind of been lost and are now re-emerging. I think I mentioned that there are national green building councils in 80 countries, which means you have actual operational entities that represent all the sectors, finance, construction, government, NGOs, academics, that have funding, that are building buildings that are really very vibrant. One thing I would say in defense of European and US countries is often the buildings that they look for, that they build in developing countries, are built to their own standards. So they don't go and say, we're going to build a green building here, but a crummy building there. They'll help drive green building in those countries, which has been helpful. This is an unbelievably large problem. We're talking not much less than 1 billion different buildings around the world. And if all of them achieve the gross inefficiencies and oversizing of US buildings, there's no way back from that. So it's a big problem. And there's some encouraging stuff going on, but it's pretty slow so far.
Right there. Yeah.
Bobby Hottenson, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. You mentioned retrofitting older buildings to be more green. How have you been able to balance historical preservation and maintaining classic architecture while also making the building more green?
It makes it harder. I'm on the advisory board of a company called Serious Materials. Serious Materials provided the 11,000 windows for the retrofit of Empire State Building. So what they did in that case is they took the windows down into the basement, set up an assembly line, pulled the glass out, which is single pane, and put in double pane glass with essentially a laminar sheet in it, which created two separate air pockets, and then essentially remanufactured it in the old window frame and put it back in again. So to comply with sort of historical preservation requirements, obviously very important. Those two things, greening and historical preservation, can be conflicting. I think some cases, what's a historical building? Well, a very interesting 1970s concrete structure that's particular style, of the sort of Stalinist style. Is that really a historic building? Well, arguably the value to that is not so great. I think there probably needs to be more flexibility on the historical side about saying, look, if it's not exactly the same, maybe that's okay. We have different lighting, different windows. but it's tough to balance those. LEED has tried to and has gone some direction that way. You get a lot of points in LEED for reuse of buildings because the embedded energy in buildings can be the equivalent of 10 years of operation of a building. So the cheapest, the most greenest building is the building you don't use. The second greenest is the reused one. And I mentioned earlier, but I think it's worth repeating that now about 60% of square footage of buildings being built to LEED or equivalent are retrofits. So it used to be all new buildings, and now increasingly it's a whole building or commercial interior, single floor at a time, upgrades to get them to green.
I'm going to interrupt with a question here. It strikes me that there's so much technology out there for doing these things, and it's evolving very rapidly, and that the homeowner, or we've heard from churches, from apartment things, following that technology and finding your way through, what was a great thing to do 5 years ago and what's available now is pretty daunting. So, what's on the horizon for, making it easier for people to proceed,
There are some, I think, really good resources. Publications like Environmental Building Design and Environmental Building News are either free or very low cost and have in them pretty detailed examples of buildings and what technologies were chosen, the challenges they faced in deployment, how they integrated, what the results were. The green building community is a community that tends to be passionate about education. So if you ever go to these green build events, the first one I spoke at, we had 80 people. It was about 14 years ago. I was like, wow, this is great. We're almost at 100. So now there are 25,000 people come to these, and the one in San Francisco next year, we expect to have 35 or 40,000. Those are really worth going to because you're walking you're looking at the technology, you get to kick the tires, you're hearing presentations in the particular building type or location that you're interested in developing. The Environmental Building News, I think, is really good. It's like $100 a year, and you get I think 8 of these a year. There's no publicity in it, so it's very honest accounting. And you can go back and look at all of the electronic records. So I can go back and I can look at the buildings, and they break out the buildings, and they define specifically all the technologies that are used in them, what they cost, where to contact them, so that the green building industry and the technologies that go in it have made themselves, I think, pretty easy to access and learn about. And there's real risk reduction in that, I think.
But I'm thinking somebody go out to remodel their house or something, they don't go figure out what to do. They call the remodeler. There's this whole, design build industry out there of, a guy and his son in a truck. And it's the kind of normal mode of doing business in a lot of household utility things. Also, there's a number of consultants and people for hire on you think about hiring an architect or something. Is that side of the housing industry, how's that moving?
I think it's gotten a lot better. I mean, you can't go out and hire people who are not competent or get technologies that are sold and they're not ready for market or they're not cost effective. But you've got 170,000 people who are LEED accredited professionals now, not all of whom know everything, but you do have a pretty large body of competent people. As you were talking about earlier, there's some great resources in Maryland and here in DC. The utility rebate programs are pretty good. I think as a rule, probably about 75 to 80% of your electricity or energy consumption in buildings are with equipment that's Energy Star rated, and as a rule, going with an Energy Star is almost always, probably always cost effective in this region. So I think there are very good resources. You might want to highlight those again. You know more about it than I do. Yeah.
The Maryland, D.C., Virginia area, there's a ton of stuff. We're a small local nonprofit. It's D.C., Virginia, Maryland, and I'll give you our information because there are some very specific things going on with churches right now. We actually, Congressman Sarbanes was just at a Presbyterian church last weekend talking about the Bay and some other things. And the same with your property management company, and we're not the only ones. There are many others in the area. I'll give you our information. I can connect you to some local places. It's easier to allow yourself to this because you could put the expert in front of the room, whomever that is. And we're working with Dr. Jay Hall. If you know him, he created the Lead for Homes program nationwide and knows a lot of these codes and how they interact. And these guys are willing to help us out. So it's if we approach this as a team effect, which is what DC is trying to do with Sustainable DC, they're trying to plug and play information. Sustainable Maryland just started. They have that same program going on, and it's all based on Sustainable Jersey, which actually now in less than 2 years had over 50% of the municipalities on board, and now they're up to about 80%. So New Jersey's actually leading the way, and Maryland's pretty far behind. I just wanted to put that out there as I'm from New Jersey. But it's just the matter of putting things into action here. A little too many task forces and too many legislative things and too many, you got to pull the trigger. So I'll connect you with some folks that are down here that can help you out.
I would just like to add, I'm Astrid Caldas, I'm with Defenders of Wildlife, and I'm also with the Green Building Institute. One of the things that we did, I'm with Sustainable Maryland, I was one of their task forces, the built environment. And one of the things that we are really pushing for is for the education of the community in an active way. Because nowadays what you see is that the information is all passive. Like you said, a homeowner wants to remodel. He has to go and find out the information, and you never know what he's going to be finding. Goes on the internet or contacts the contractor. But if the government or local governments actively put the word out that these resources are there for the remodeling of your house, for saving energy, then I think we believe that there would be a better chance of the information that you said. People will know that it's only 1 or 2% more expensive. It's not 30% more expensive to do a green building. So I just kind of valuing the education aspect of it in an active way, not only having the information somewhere for people, but actually putting the word out more actively. Thank you.
That reminds me of a discussion we were having in a group, Solutions from the Land, which is trying to partner ag and biodiversity and conservation in trying to work on sustainability issues in agriculture. And one of the complaints that they had was that the ag extension agents, you know, the whole agricultural extension service was a tremendous thing, but it's largely fallen apart or is becoming less functional. But what you're talking about really is kind of an Department of Energy extension agent kind of functionality that would be an interesting thing to consider. Yeah.
Great.
So these extension things are not popular in town.
Thank you all.
Okay, do we have any other? All right, well, I think we can wind it up here. I want to thank Greg for a great talk.
Are there any platinum buildings in town?
Yeah. Yeah. There are probably 10 of them. WWF building is the new bank, the new PNC headquarters is platinum.
I'd like to briefly thank those people who are joining us over the internet